Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm so grateful that we get to celebrate Asian Pacific Islander Month together. We have a most honorable guest today, but I will leave that to his friend Mark to introduce all of the intricacies of his background. But I'd like to begin with just thanks. Um, thank you. I'm so grateful that we have the opportunity to celebrate together in a year filled with so much turmoil and anti-Asian violence and anti-Asian discrimination. This is a time to celebrate achievements. I specifically, when we were thinking of this, is how can we talk about the impact of our Asian Pacific Islander community on history. I know we like to talk about different pinpoints in history, but our history is Asian Pacific Islander history. And in fact, this celebration is directly tied to the date, and the commemoration was directly tied to the first Japanese immigrant arrival, May 7th, 1843, and also in commemoration of the first transcontinental railroad, which was built primarily by Chinese immigrants. And so our country's history is built on the labor, the intellectual capacity, and the gifts of our Asian Pacific Islander community. I'm privileged that we have this opportunity to hear from our honored guest, retired Chief Warden Officer 2, Nicholas Punimata. And I'm so grateful that our veteran coordinator, Mark Drown, had his rugby background because in a Zoom session, and it triggered me because I love rugby. So then this is all in the middle of a meeting. It triggered a conversation about bringing Nicholas in, and I'm so grateful that he had that background because I love rugby. And so we started off talking about you in relation to rugby, and then we went into your extraordinary service to the nation. And so without further ado, I want to pass the baton off to Mark to introduce his wonderful friend.
Thank you, Aaliyah, and thank you everybody for attending this. And it's exciting to have the opportunity to bring a good friend in. This photo behind me is some of the boys that are on the Army 7's rugby team, and these are the island boys. These are guys from American Samoa, Tonga, Samoa, and we have 3 Fijians in that photo, and we have one guy who wanted to be in that photo named Mike Melendez, who's from Puerto Rico, and he said, "Hey, I'm from an island too." So he joined that group, and it's just a great group of guys. So my history with Nick goes back several decades, and it was from being involved with Army rugby, and Nick and I just hit it off, became fast friends from that point on. And we also worked in the same community in the Army and the Special Forces community. And I had the opportunity to become the head coach of the U.S. Army team back in 2012, and the first name out of my mouth to be assistant coach and manager was Nick Punimata. So real quick, Nick Punimata is a Chief Warrant Officer 4, and the 2 was from the old photo of him getting the Douglas MacArthur Award, which is a very big deal. He was the first Army warrant officer in the history of the Army to receive the leadership award called the Douglas MacArthur Award, and that was usually for captains. So that was a big deal for Nick. Nick spent time in the Ranger Regiment and then went on over to the 1st Special Forces Group, and its area of operation is the Pacific Rim. So Nick has extensive experience living in Okinawa, Vietnam, Cambodia, Philippines, pretty much all over the Pacific. And his children are also in the military, and they're doing wonderful. So with that, I want to introduce everybody to CW4 retired Nick Punimata, who's actually doing this teleconference from Hawaii. So Nick, welcome, and just please give us some background of your youth and just your whole American journey.
Well, Mark and Aaliyah, thank you very much. I'm very honored and privileged to be a speaker, and never really been asked before to do something like this, but I'm honored the fact that somebody would consider it. My journey in, at least in respects to this particular forum, I think is pretty interesting, and I think it correlates with things that cultural wise, we see growing up. And I'll back this up a little bit. When I came, or my parents resettled in the States back in the 1960s, the early 60s, both my sisters and I, we didn't speak much English. So we kind of learned English going to primary school. Our first grade and second, we started to catch on with the English language. But I do remember my
where would you like
grade
the envelope?
On the table. Grade school teacher mentioning, about giving me more words to kind of help my English speaking out. So it was kind of neat that she was willing to help, but I could see the difference a little bit, that it was going to be catching up quite a bit. And so it took a little while, but by the time I was in the fourth grade, my English had got fairly good, and so did my sisters. And we managed to take opportunities when they came for us, and it was really interesting. But my parents, when my father got out of the military, we relocated again, and we moved to another area of Los Angeles. Again, it was trying to help develop opportunities for us as children, but at the same time, my parents were taking advantage of school opportunities for themselves. Eventually, both my parents finished college. My father with a master's degree in accounting, and my mother had actually 3 master's degrees. She was a registered nurse. She had been through nursing school, and she was a graduate of Cal State Dominguez Hills, and also Los Angeles State University College, or university, in where she received her degrees in nursing and post-child development. So it's really interesting. And for us as children of these two very interesting people, what was really ironic was that they had the opportunity to push us, or to provide us, I should say, opportunities to, one, look beyond the high school level, and then look beyond the university level on the career that we were all looking to try to develop, from the early days. Is what were we going to do as adults, given the opportunity to live in the U.S. At the same time, they were keen enough for us to provide us trips back to Samoa quite often. And I think that's where I started to really look at the culture and what I missed out, but yet what I was learning, being in the U.S. Learning the culture in Samoa is interesting. It's like nowhere else, just like many other places are nowhere else like other places. But the interesting thing was that there was a good correlation between what was developing in Samoa with, the culture of the Western cultures being inundated and being developed, which was good. So for us as children learning our culture in Samoa and being able to take that with us back to the U.S., we kind of understood, where the disciplines and where the family structure really came from, but at the same time is developing it while we were there, living in the U.S. So it was a good platform for me to kind of see the cultural side of the Samoa and all those other cultures tied into it. And I could see, and we could live it, since there were plenty of Polynesian families within the community, as there were other cultures in the Polynesian community. There were Tongans and there were Fijians, and there were also, Tokelau's. So that was really interesting to kind of see that living in Los Angeles. But at the same time, we were still trying to pave our own way through high school, and then trying to determine what were we going to do beyond high school. So interesting from that perspective. As I look back, the different roads taken. One of the interesting things was to look at where a lot of Polynesian folks were living in the service, were working in the service industry, which was not it wasn't a bad livelihood. It was a good livelihood. It was honest, good work. But at the same time, for the children of those paveway leaders, I guess you can call them, those first generations of Polynesians coming out, they were trying to establish their families and give their kids something better than what they were doing. And I think that was something I started to really look at as I went about my career, particularly as I looked at college. So I was finishing up high school. After graduation, I took the same road of college as my parents, attending junior college, and then applying to go to the next level. That was very interesting in itself. That for me, I think it was kind of overbearing sometimes to look at your classmates and seeing the levels of education that they were striving for, and they were trying to achieve something way beyond what I considered, which was just being able to get to college and attend, even if I didn't graduate. It was just getting the knowledge, and that was more satisfying to me. But at the same time, you start to realize, to get to the next pinnacles of a career, you do need to graduate. So, you buckle down and you do those things that make you successful in that particular realm. So from the college side of it completed, I really was hoping to kind of look at what was beyond college. What was, what am I going to do? And I was fortunate enough to work at LAX after college. And ironically enough, I had lunch one day. I was working the graveyard shift, and I went home in the morning, and I was sitting at a Denny's looking across the street, and behold, I'm looking at this office, and it had our, military recruiting office. So as I sat there and ate breakfast and thinking about my job and thinking about that, I wonder what that's like, having only gotten a little bit of information from my father, who was a military man. I thought, what benefits are there, that I could take advantage of there, and better myself. So eventually I walked across the street, and at that point, the recruiter that I happened to meet was actually a Polynesian sergeant first class, Vietnam veteran. We kind of looked eye to eye, and he says, he welcomed me in there, and his name, I will say, it was an interesting deliberation of what the Army could provide. And it was interesting enough that I decided to take the challenge. And so I came in the Army in late 1981, early 1982. And while in the Army, I did see a good diversity of people. Very, very interesting diversity of people in my recruiting class or in my basic training. You also saw that in the advanced individual training sessions, those months that you spend learning a job. And my job as an infantryman, at the time, there wasn't a lot of requirements other than the fact that you could pass the physical fitness exams and some of the general skills tests that got you into that. But it was interesting enough that when I got to basic training and moved on to AIT, I did notice that there were a little bit of smaller numbers of people moving on from each session. And what I learned from that was, if you didn't get what they were training and what they were teaching you the first time around, you had an opportunity to relearn it. It wasn't the best way to do it because you didn't want to really go back and learn something a second time. So I managed to keep moving first time around. And eventually I ended up in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And I was stationed there for about a year and a half. And then I moved on to serve in the 75th Ranger Regiment in Fort Benning, Georgia. There again, some of these units that are really unique in the military, the numbers are small because they're all volunteers, but even smaller when you look at the cultural side. There were plenty of diehard Americans, from the South that were made up a lot of these units, and a sprinkling of, everything else around from the outer shell of the U.S. But it was a great group of Americans, great group of people. And along the way in that unit, I got a chance to meet some great Americans who were just phenomenal leaders who eventually became general officers in the Army. Eventually, my road took me to volunteer, which is something you don't want to always consider doing, maybe. But I volunteered and I went to Special Forces training. And after about 2.5 years in the training cycle, I finally finished, which is about the average at the time. Finished, and then I reported to my first Special Forces duty assignment at Fort Lewis, Washington. There, I was inundated with the culture of that particular base because it was very diverse in terms of everything from Hispanics, Puerto Ricans, to Polynesians, to Orientals. And it was a great atmosphere because Seattle, which wasn't too far north, had that same kind of dissect of cultures. So it was really, really neat to hear, and really, really good. I did spend some time in Okinawa. I spent about 4.5 years in Okinawa. And there was an interesting deployment, or I should say assignment, where we really got to dive head first into the Okinawan culture, which I thought was really good. When I moved my family back we were reassigned back to Washington State, we thought back about our time in Okinawa. And that was really interesting because Okinawa gave us a good scope of a culture of the Okinawans, Japanese, that was unique, more unique than anything else I'd ever experienced at that time. My children got a chance to learn a lot of the little small things in that culture that were significant to families. And my wife, who is a phenomenal woman, she was the biggest advocate for learning culture. So she provided opportunities to take the kids out on trips and expose them to things that the Okinawan culture, were able to provide, but at the same time, just taking them out on weekends to road trips around the island. One of the most unique things I think my kids ever really learned was just experiencing and being places where the language was the barrier, but yet at the same time, it was their reception or their receptibility to understanding. Just because the language is different doesn't mean the culture is really that different. We're all the same. We all give and we all take a little bit, but we share a lot of things in common. So my children really, I think, gravitated to that, and I'll always be grateful for my wife doing that to expose them. And that was even more important when we would take trips back to Samoa as a family. So that was really interesting. And part of my journey on that was when I was in school in Special Forces training, my wife and I made a conscious decision to move her and the kids back to Samoa for about 1.5 years to live with my parents, to kind of, one, expose the kids more to the culture. Two, it was the language, to give them more exposure to the language. And then 3, to kind of really spend time with my parents and the family. And they did. They spent an enormous amount of time learning a lot of things, but at the same time, I think they still retain that after all these years. My kids still speak very fondly of that. At the same time, my wife, who was actually born and raised in Idaho on a farm, one of the biggest things I think that my wife agreed to, and I agreed to it very much, was if we gave our kids exposure to my culture, it's only right that we give exposure to my kids in her culture, which was to live in Idaho. So for the remaining part of my training, the last year and a half, my children and my wife lived with her parents in Idaho, small little farm. And that was probably one of the best things I think they'd ever experienced as well from that side, because her family, it's just her, and it was her younger brother, raised on a small farm, and her parents. And they really got to gravitate to both sides of the family. So my children have very, very good memories, very fond memories of their grandparents from my wife's side. And it's interesting that they got a chance to do that, because I think that made them, I think, more receptive to ideas, to exposure, but it also gave them an understanding of two different worlds. And they can certainly groove together, I guess would be a good word. They laid together in terms of their upbringing. They understood that very well. And they still, to this day, understand and how to mesh the two cultures together. So as I continued on with my training and eventually my reporting to the Special Forces Unit.
Hey, Nick.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I ask you to share, if you don't mind, some of the friction initially when you were going to marry Sharon, and some of the cultural mores that you were going to be dealing with? You shared that with me, and I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but I remember.
Oh, no worries.
I think it's very, because I know how important the grandparents are in Polynesian culture.
Yeah.
If you could kind of share what their reaction was and kind of the things you had to deal with on that, because right now I know there was that side of it. I think it's important to share as well.
Okay. Yeah, I think, well, it's interesting enough that when I met my wife in the Army, we obviously got along very well. And there was a point there where we realized, we could make this work, we can make it go. But in order to do that, it'd be better if we were man and wife to kind of look in what direction we were both going to go and go it together. So I asked her to marry me. She said yes. And so interesting enough, my wife says, my parents, they haven't been outside Idaho. They're homegrown folks. They don't know a lot about the outside cultures. So we should call them. And I said, absolutely, we should. So I was with her at her unit, and back then we had payphones, and so we were on the payphone to call her parents. So as I had my ear and she had her ear on the one side of the phone, and I was listening, and she was talking, and she dialed her parents, and her parents picked up, and they told her, well, this is Sharon, and I wanted to tell you and Dad something. And so her father picked up the other phone in the other room, and they were both listening. And so Sharon did tell, she goes, well, I'm getting married. And there's a bit of silence. And he goes, well, who's the individual you're marrying? Said, well, he's from Samoa. And then I heard this little chuckle on the other side. She said, oh my God, it's a chocolate drop. I didn't know what that meant at the time. And I think one of the parents said at the time, he goes, do you realize what your kids will look like when you have them? And, kind of taken back by that remark, but at the same time, Sharon dove heavily into that. She goes, no, they'll be just fine. You'll be just fine. And ironically enough, I thought, at that moment, I really wasn't receptive to that idea of maybe this wasn't a good idea, of that idea of telling them, maybe it wasn't a good idea. But, you know, I heard a lot of silence on that phone for the next few minutes. And at the same time, you know, I looked at my soon-to-be wife, and I was just looking at her, and she was telling me, you know, just to calm down a little bit, you know, it'll be all right. That the statement she had made, you know, do you have any idea what your kids will look like? You know, again, I don't fault them, because they really never really ventured outside their comfort zone, so they didn't know. Being from a small town and farmers, they lived a certain lifestyle, and they were comfortable with it. So now here we to get developing this relationship. So from that perspective, it really kind of put me in a hamstring, in a position where I wasn't really comfortable with them. And eventually, after about 2 years, we did take a trip home after we were married, and our son was already born. And we took that trip home, to her home. And interestingly enough, you know, when our son was born, he was born with blonde hair, blue eye, or hazel eyes. So it wasn't, it wasn't anything that anybody did, but it was just the fact that, you know, I still thought back to that comment that was made. And, you know, our other children are just as fine. You know, one came out, you know, with darker hair than the other one, than the first one. And then she came out with brown eyes. And then we had one that came out with blue eyes. So, but I think when we met her parents, that was a cultural shock to them, being the fact that she was marrying somebody not from her local community. At the same time, I think when they saw the kids, I think they understood, you know, the kind of the standpoint that they were leaning on, or their points of view, I think were miscued, because they were very, very giving people. They gave a lot over the years. But at the same time, they, you know, they asked questions, which was good. I was glad they did. And they were very inquisitive, but at the same time, they were very giving. So they managed to understand that their viewpoints on who their daughter married wasn't anything of a negative point. It was actually as beneficial as anybody else. And for them not to understand that, you know, it was something they had to work on. They did for many, many years until they both passed. But we became very good friends. We became, I don't know, we spent a lot of time with them, and they understood it. And ironically enough, her father came out to visit my parents in Samoa after my parents retired, and were living in Samoa for years. And we had a great time, about 3 weeks together in Samoa. We got to teach him and provide him some lessons that he really didn't think about in terms of culture, of ever being exposed to culture like ours, for Polynesian culture. So I gave my hat off to him, and I'll always be grateful for him that he wanted to learn the culture. That, to me, that says a lot about our character. He's a good man. He's a good man.
Nick, thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're off to the Ranger Regiment, doing great things.
Yep. I spent my time there, and you know, the Army being diverse as it is, we had 4 other Polynesian kids in that unit, and all of us kind of gravitated to each other, but we also gravitated to our members of our our company and our platoons and our squads. And one of the interesting things there was didn't see very many Polynesian kids. A few Puerto Ricans, but for the most part, race or anything else didn't have nothing to do with the job you were doing, the unit you were with. So that was really interesting. I learned a lot about it. Got to deploy some good places, interesting places. I think as I spent my time there, and I deployed on a combat operation, and with only one of those Samoan friends, members, there was only one assigned at the time we deployed. And I do think of him quite often, but at the same time, I think about a young man from California who didn't make it back with us. But, so whenever I think about, young men, I always think about those two. The Polynesian boy, he made it back. Wasn't the same, but I tried to stay as close as I could with him. And I've lost contact with him over the years. But interesting enough, I learned a lot from there going forward, and seeing what my lessons from the Ranger Regiment and from those particular people assigned to that unit provided me as I moved on with my career. Eventually, I volunteered, went on to Special Forces training.
Nick, can you talk about when you were a sergeant in the Special Forces, and then the opportunity to become a commissioned warrant officer, and then the recognition you received from that, and kind of what your philosophy has been working with young men, regardless of their backgrounds and socioeconomic history. I mean, I've watched you work with our kids for years, and I just love how you work with kids. But they're kids to us, but they're young men and women. Yeah. But yeah, please share that. And so far, you're doing great. Thank you.
Yeah, when I came over to Special Forces, one of the key things that I learned there was about learning your abilities to communicate, but at the same time conveying something to another individual, maybe in a different language, to get him to complete a given task. And when I look back at that little particular type of vignette that is a core of the Special Forces mission, it is interesting. It is like teaching somebody something completely out of their realm that's done in a different language. And one of the best things I think that I learned from Special Forces was the ability to train an individual who doesn't speak my language in an art or a skill that is new to him, that also will depend on his survivability. And that is one of the key things that I think I've taken away from learning the job in Special Forces as a what we would call a force multiplier or a trainer or of skills. In that same point, I guess one of the things I looked at was when I had the opportunity to do sports in the military. I enjoy sports. I love it. It's part of the makeup of the military, but at the same time, it's part of the makeup of the individual. And when I transitioned over from being a non-commissioned officer to a warrant officer after spending several years on the team, I was now at the realm of being considered managerial, which is, I didn't mind, because at some parts of my job, I was doing some managerial work, but just not in command of anything or in charge of anything. It was just to get things done. I was given the opportunity when I decided to volunteer for the Special Forces Warrant program. Something unique about it. I made that decision to go after sitting down with a couple of warrant officers in my unit who I really looked up to, and both were very good leaders. Both were very good men of conviction, and certainly they had a lot of experience to back them up. And one of the things they taught me is, if you want somebody to understand what you're teaching, dummy it down to the lowest entity as if they were talking to you, as you were talking to yourself, basically. And the interesting thing was, we've done that, but I just didn't realize how we were doing that, even though we were doing that on several different occasions. But one of the best things I did learn was from being able to look at things from my perspective and then trying to convey it. How do I get somebody else to do what I'm asking? And so I did learn. I did look back at a lot of my career. I look back at lessons that are being done currently, at the time with my deployments. I look at the team members. And from my perspective at the time as a newly penned W1 on these deployments, one of the best things you can do is coach your teammates to get to the end state. What is the end? I always look back to see, did we accomplish what we accomplished? Did we convey the right message to our guys to convey to help them with their job, basically? And for the most part, that's part of the Special Forces mantra, is to sit down and look at how we're going to do something, dissect it, and then seeing and analyzing whether it's achievable or not. And for the most part, it is achievable, but it's how we mind melt it and how we think it through. And so as a warrant officer, I got a chance to help manage a lot of our programs, a lot of our missions overseas. And I think once you get that understood in your own mind, what is that point of success, and you feel it, you experience it, there's nothing like it, because it's very rewarding. It's very rewarding to know that when you leave somewhere, somebody else is going to be better off. And I think that's the whole thing where I look at it and I say, how do we make things better? How do we, the old saying, leave the Green Beret, in a better spot, or, make it so when they see that symbol, they know they will get, a good opportunity. They will get good training. They will get to experience something very unique and very rewarding. So from a perspective of being a warrant officer in the Army, I think that's part of one of the big things is carrying the message of success, and how do we get success? How do we get from point A to point B with as few hiccups in between, but yet achieving a standard of success where commands and directors are looking at and say, yes, thank you. Thank you. You did achieve the end state that we wanted, and we thank you. So from that perspective, I think my whole mission in my career in the Special Forces as a warrant has been to achieve success, like anybody else, but at the same time, it's what lies up underneath. And I think having that opportunity, Mark, when we were coaching, or as we coached that first year, I think back of that. That's been a good lesson for me as you and I look back at that first year of 2012. We floundered terribly. You and I both knew, we weren't there at that right spot, and it showed. And we kind of revamped our mindsets. We looked at our missions, at our mission state individually. I know we talked about it. How do we, was it us? Was it them? And we revamped our ideas. We revamped our makeup. We did a lot of things, I think, right. And, the old saying, the proof is in the pudding. And we certainly put a good pudding together, because from that point on, we had the right mix. And I take that back to just like an ODA on a team. You've got to get them the right mindset in. You've got to get them in a place where everything is achievable, but it takes a little bit of time and effort. But once you do complete it, the rewards are fantastic. Yeah. So,
Hey, Nick, when I hear you talking about your life experiences, and there's a constant that keeps coming out, you always identified a role model. How important that is to from your perspective, if you were talking to young people, men and women, finding role models or somebody to learn from their experience, how important that is, was that in your life? I've seen your kids, you know, they're phenomenal. You know, they've married. I mean, there is no color in your family. It's just, it doesn't even come up. I mean, Saw married a Fijian, you know, Mosi, and, you know, Eki's married, you know, someone from Idaho, for lack of better words. And then, you know, Nu'u, he's married a beautiful woman, and they're just great kids. And that's because they had you and Sharon as role models, and you had your parents. How do you recommend young people do that? Because with today's massive amounts of information and disinformation, and I mean, you would just think everything is just so terrible, but it's not. There's so many wonderful things out there. What would you tell young people and faculty? Because look, I'm at a college, we're all at a college, and I know the faculty that I work with know that they are role models and they're mentors. I mean, so talking to young people, how important is it to have a role model, mentor in your development?
But I think role models are the norm. I think, but at the same time, it's what kind of role model do we look at, you know? And obviously, you go to what you're comfortable with. My parents were both my role models. At the same time, they had, you know, we had other family members who I gravitated to just because of their demeanor, because of the way they did things. I think in this time and age, parents are the biggest role models we have. It's unfortunate that there's so much on social media that, you know, the children are exposed to. But again, that's irrelevant as far as I'm concerned, because it all boils down to what's at home. You have a good home where everything is, you know, is done to a point of what's right and what is wrong. You teach your children what's right. I sincerely believe that, you know, if you teach them what's right the first time around, there is no going back second, third, or fourth to correct something. At the same time, discipline is important. I do believe in discipline. Now, I'm not, you know, the one that will throw a kid around or nothing like that. But the point is that that's how some homes, I'm sure that's how it's done. In Polynesian culture, there is no sparing of the stick. But at the same time, I think when parents convey their disappointment in their children for something that was done by them, it goes back to the parents, but at the same time, it's the parents' job to tell them what they did wrong and why it's wrong and what could happen because it was wrong. At the same time, you teach them the right way to do things. And I think that's where both my wife and we both agree on discipline. At the same time, we expect them to carry and share their share of the load, whatever that load may be. There is a requirement in our home as they grew up. You know, your job is to be a kid, right? But it's also your job to be a very disciplined kid. You don't make noise when adults are around. Yeah, you know, you don't play with things in front of others, you know, that kind of thing. But at the same time, I think parents, it's important. If you're willing to have a child, then you've got to be willing to accept responsibilities on how he turns out or how she turns out. That's always been a big thing. My parents were big disciplinarians. It was never an issue on using the rod, so to speak. At the same time, they praised us when we did well. And I use that same concept here with my children. Developing them, they don't know what direction to go unless somebody tells them. So when somebody tells them, you reinforce it. But the same way, you've got to tell them what the pitfalls are along the way. And I think I learned that from my parents. You know, they taught they taught me the virtues of discipline, but at the same time, they also taught me some virtues about being, giving praise when praise is due. At the same time, back up the praise. At the same time, when needed, back up the scolding as you need it. But I think that was a big lesson for me growing up, was understanding when discipline was applied and what reinforcements behind it without having to continue on with the physical side of it. But same time, that's what my kids, I think my wife and I did a great job on that with our children. At least that's what at least in my household. I think they did very well. They were able to walk on their own and do things on their own without having mom and dad around. So I'm appreciative for them for learning the lessons. At the same time, I want them to carry on those lessons if and when they have their own children. So,
Nick, I just wanted to say thank you. First of all, I know your children. I know your daughters are strong women. I know your wife. She's definitely a strong woman. Son, who's a great kid. He's going to be a great family man himself. And at this juncture, I also want to say thank you for sharing some very personal, moments. And with that said, and I'd like to open this back up to Aaliyah. I mean, I know you're a very funny, jovial guy. So I've got you on the serious side, and it's not who you are. I mean, I know you have that laser focus when you need to, but 80% of the time I'm around Nick, it's always just cutting up. It's fun. It's always just a pleasure to be around you. And I wish I could convey that to everybody that's attending this. What a great man you are, and a role model. And I love the stories when Nu'u had to go back and live with his grandparents in American Samoa, because he was going through some 14-year-old, I think was the age, when he's just kind of a mouthy kid. And being raised by the grandparents, he's got some hilarious stories about going back to the island. I wish we could have Nu'u on here. So with that said, thank you so much, Nick. And I'm going to pass this back to Aaliyah, and I'll see you soon, my friend. And I'll be quiet now and let anybody ask any questions or follow-ups.
I'll just begin by saying thank you. And number one, forgive me for getting your rank incorrect, because you earned not 2, but 4. And I want to apologize for that profusely.
No worries. It's easy. It's understandable. Got it.
Thank you for the grace. I appreciate it.
All
right. I just want to say, if you were here, we would be opening the floor with food for you and drink and sharing and showing our love, because it costs you something to tell your story. It costs you something to share your legacy. And I know we only got a teeny tiny bit. So if you ever want to come back, you have an open invite.
Thank you.
To give of your life in the way in service to the nation, but also in service to your family. I thank you. I feel like I've been listening to my uncle. It's such a gift to hear the lessons that you've learned in your lifetime, and to be able to share that so freely. Feel free to share any stories you want about Mark. We are taking notes.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, it's long. It's long.
Good thing it's my last day Friday.
All right. Well, listen, thank you so much for the opportunity. It's not often somebody gets a chance to lay his kind of pseudo life story out there, but I'm glad I got a chance to share it. And I'm glad that I was asked to be a part of the celebration. Don't know how much I gave to it, but I do think the awareness of the culture, of any culture, is important. It's important to not just the people in that culture, but it's also important for others to hear and to learn and to understand. It just makes things a lot easier for us to communicate, I think, and understand. When we understand where each other comes from and what we provide each other as a crutch in life, because we all need a crutch every now and then. So Thank you very much, Mark. I appreciate you throwing me out to the wolves, but it was a good set of wolves. I loved it. Thank you very much.
And before we end, I also want to give a special thank you to Ashley and Anthony from our cafe. They have prepared a special meal. So unfortunately, Nick, you're not here for the meal, but we'll take a picture and send it to you.
Oh, please do. And if Mark gets any of that stuff before you guys do, I want you to put them outside.
Definitely.
I'm driving over there, Nick. It's going to be about a 15-minute drive, and I'm going to eat.
Oh my gosh, that's funny. That's great. Awesome. Well, I appreciate it, and thank you very much. It's been an honor. It's been a great honor.
And we'll be putting this on our YouTube page. So we'll send you a link if you want to link in your children with this story. I know how important legacy is, and they've probably heard all your stories a million times, but somehow hearing your parents' voice and hearing the love that you conveyed to them and the love that came from your parents to you is a gift. And so thank you for that. And Tina's going to share our special menu.
I don't have my glasses.
We're going to break out the special glasses.
Oh, hang on.
Oh, never mind. I put her on the spot like Mark did to you.
So it's something like sweet sour pork belly.
Ooh.
I'm in Haupia.
Oh.
I don't see any palusami though. Sorry.
Oh, well, it's okay. You got something. That's
right.
different.
Yeah. So it's Hawaiian shoyu pork belly served with pineapple, rice, saimin, and haupia. From
Sounds
our
like
cafeteria.
a good menu to me.
Yeah.
It's a great menu there.
Well, thank you. We'll if there are any questions, feel free to put it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself.
And Nick, I would love to meet up with you sometime.
Absolutely, be my pleasure. My pleasure. I hope we will get a chance to meet. And if not, maybe the good Lord will find us somewhere down the road, and we'll get a chance.
Right.
And I hope to meet up with you as well, Aliyah. Thank you so much for including me on this, and I can't be grateful enough. Say thank you.
We have a thank you in the chat. Thank you, Nick. This was great.
Really appreciated that, Nick. This is Frank from Humboldt State University, and I just really enjoyed your story and the way you navigated that story. Definitely brought insights and the familial type cultural differences that a lot of us do have. And again, thank you, and thank you, Leah, for putting this together.
Thank you, Frank.
And as we come to an end, I also want to say thank you to Mark. We have been in a pandemic and we haven't actually been in the same room, but I feel like I gained a friend, in a sort of weird way. It's just been a pleasure and a privilege to serve this campus with you and alongside you. Your heart for all students, but especially veterans, is comes across the screen in such an enormous way. So thank you for your service to our community. I'm a little jealous of your next mission, but I get to live vicariously through you. And I'm gonna be missing my rugby buddy, but maybe later.
I will do everything I can to keep, I'm only gonna be in Ferndale still, but I will be out of the area, coming back in and out. I know I can get Nick down here with his wife to come visit. So we'll come over to the campus and we'll all hang out, and that would be a great time to actually see everybody and be in the campus. And thank you for the card you sent me. I appreciate that very much.
You are welcome. We have a couple other thank yous. We have a thank you to Mark from Kente. Good luck in the future. We also have our public safety officer, caught the last half, but was very grateful for your service, Nick. And so as we come to a close, I just want to take this time to, I'm so grateful that our Congress has set aside this month. Our history is Asian Pacific Islander history. Our history is Black History Month. Our history is our Native American History Month. And so often we see these as separate time frames, but everything is interwoven. So I'm so grateful to have had this opportunity, excuse me, to celebrate. And we hope to continue to celebrate in the days to come. So thank you so much for each person in attendance. And for those who will watch this later on, I'm sorry you won't get the meal for today, but maybe Ashley and Anthony will prepare the meal for us in the future. Thank you for the partnership. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.